Bride's family disrespects Groom's black grandmother, then they get the shock of their lives. She entered the wedding like a quiet shadow. No greetings, no questions. They assumed she was just an inconvenient guest, draped in a worn navy dress, belonging to a past no one here cared to remember. But within a few hours, the crowd would rise to their feet. A billionaire would bow his head, and those who once scoffed would beg for forgiveness. This wasn't a story about status. It was a lesson in character. Stay until the end, because some truths only shine when the glitter has faded. The black Bentley glided silently past the gate of white roses, rolling into the Rosemore estate, a historic vineyard tucked in the heart of Napa Valley, where sunlight spilled like golden wine through winding arches of trees. The wedding of Claire Remington and Julian Whitmore was less than 30 minutes from officially beginning, but the whispers had already started long before the music ever did. Not whispers about the couple, but about the woman who had just stepped out of the car. Lena Whitmore, Julian's 78-year-old grandmother, rested her hand on his arm as she stepped down with quiet majesty. No fanfare needed. Her silver hair was pulled into a neat bun. Her deep brown eyes held a serenity that cut through the clamor of celebration. She wore a simple navy dress, paired with a strand of ivory pearls. No sequins, no designer label. And yet, when she walked, the air seemed to pause for half a breath. Julian adjusted the edge of his tuxedo and linked her arm with his. "I always wanted you to be the first person I walked in with today," he said, his voice low but steady. Lena gave a gentle nod. "You did right." No one stepped forward. No official greeting. No ceremonial embrace. Margot Remington, the bride's mother, stood near the outdoor reception path, a glass of white wine shimmering in her hand. Her eyes flicked quickly to Lena's dress, then shifted to a social smile as cold as frost. A woman beside her leaned in and whispered, "Maybe she missed the memo on the dress code." Margot curled her lips just enough to elicit a soft chuckle from a few nearby guests. No one laughed out loud, but no one hid their glances either. Lena heard every word, but she didn't flinch. She didn't lower her head. She didn't show a trace of hurt. She simply held Julian's hand a little tighter, as if to say, "Keep walking." Claire's father, Mr. Charles Remington, the same man once featured on the cover of the Bay Area Business Weekly, offered only a dismissive nod when Julian introduced his grandmother. No handshake, no eye contact. His gaze didn't land on her. It passed right through her. "That's fine," he said curtly to Julian. "The garden area is ready." Julian's brow furrowed, but before he could say a word, Lena placed her hand gently on his chest, extinguishing the fire rising inside him. "Don't let small minds dim a big day," she said softly. She was no stranger to that kind of look, to that kind of person, to spaces draped in flowers and champagne but lacking even a trace of true regard. They assumed she was the honorary guest of the lower middle class. An exception is allowed in the room. What they didn't know, or didn't bother to learn, was that Lena Whitmore wasn't just any grandmother. And what they especially didn't know was this: in just a few hours, every last one of them would be forced to look at themselves through her reflection. The Napa Valley afternoon bathed the lawns of Rosemore Estate in a gentle golden glow no stage light could imitate. Lavender swayed softly in the breeze, Debussy played under trees draped in crystal chandeliers, and the stone pathway was dressed with white orchids and blush roses, perfectly curated to match the timeless elegance Margot Remington had been planning since January. Inside, ivory Italian linen covered the banquet tables, baccarat champagne flutes lined up in perfect rows, and the 5-course menu was printed in shimmering metallic ink. Guests from New York, London, and Zurich wandered in, one hand holding a glass of Dom Perignon, the other a business card. It was flawless, until Lena Whitmore chose to sit at a small table near the edge of the garden beside a wisteria bush. No one invited her there. No one asked her to move. It was as if no one quite knew what category to place her in. Margot walked past, her arm linked with a woman in a Valentino gown, barely glancing at Lena before turning away. No eye contact, just a glance. Nearby, a group of middle-aged women laughed near the cocktail bar. One of them said loudly enough to rise above the music, "It's sweet that Julian still keeps in touch with his roots. Not many at this level do." Another tilted her head. "Was she the old nanny?" "No. I heard she's his grandmother." Lena didn't flinch. She simply turned her silver teacup in her hand, her gaze drifting past the vineyards as if this place had never truly been meant for her. Not that she had ever needed anyone's permission to belong anywhere. From the guest house, Claire emerged in her glittering Ely Saab gown, radiant, hugging each relative with poise. But when her eyes landed on Lena, the smile faltered, and she turned away without a word. Julian, standing near the wine bar, saw it all. He looked at Claire, then at Margot, who had just pulled her daughter aside and was whispering with a voice sweet as honey, sharp as glass. "There's no need to force it with people from a different tier. Just keep the smile where it belongs." No one realized that just a few more steps, just a single introduction, would be enough to bring those tears crashing down. And Lena, the woman sitting quietly at the garden's edge, would become the center of every eye in the room, without moving a single inch. The music still floated gently through the air. The champagne still shimmered in the afternoon sun. But something around Lena's table had shifted. Not suddenly, but like a current slowly reversing course, quiet and unstoppable. A couple from Boston strolled over, intending to sit. But just as the husband touched the back of a chair, his eyes caught Margot's from across the lawn. She said nothing, only tilted her head slightly, the wine glass angling ever so casually in her hand. The couple veered away without a word, and took seats elsewhere. Lena noticed, but her face didn't change. She'd seen subtler slights than this. Moments later, a young server approached with a tray of hors d'oeuvres. Just as Lena reached for one, an older woman in an emerald gown stepped in to chat with the boy. They laughed. The tray turned away from Lena, then disappeared into the crowd. No one noticed. No one apologized. At a nearby table, Charles Remington was recounting his negotiations with a Japanese conglomerate. His voice carried with the tone of a man used to being listened to in silence. "When you walk into a boardroom, don't let history drag you down," he declared, lifting his glass. "Some traditions are worth preserving, but some are best left behind." Polite laughter followed. Lena didn't join in. She knew exactly what kind of traditions he meant. And she also knew it was men like Charles who once made her learn how to defend herself, not with degrees, but with quiet resilience. Julian stood nearby, hearing it all. His eyes flicked from Charles to Claire and finally to his grandmother. He began to step toward her, but Lena gently raised a hand, eyes still fixed on her teacup. A silent gesture. Not yet. Claire kept the smile on her lips, but her palms were soaked in sweat. She could feel it. Julian was looking at her differently now. And deep down, she knew. The man standing beside her was beginning to ask questions. A female entrepreneur from Chicago, apparently unaware of the party's unspoken rules, walked over and tried to strike up a conversation with Lena. She smiled and asked something about the vineyard. But just as Lena began to answer, a voice called from the stage. Startled, the woman gave a quick nod and excused herself. The conversation hadn't even started, already cut short by someone else's priority, just like so many moments in Lena's life. She sat there, still and silent as a mountain, facing all the sideways glances, all the carefully curated gaps, all the politeness wrapped in shiny paper labeled respect. She had thought she'd be emotional watching her grandson get married. But now, the lump in her throat wasn't from tears. It was from a truth she knew too well. In the places with the brightest lights, people can be the coldest. She set down her teacup and glanced around. Not to find anyone, but as if to test the air, to weigh something. A gentle breeze drifted through, carrying the scent of wisteria and designer perfume. But beneath all the gloss and sparkle, something was shifting. Small, quiet, but enough to begin tipping the scales. Lena felt it clearly. All it would take was the right person, the right moment, the right words, and the truth would speak for itself. In the far corner of the garden, amid orchestrated laughter and designer gowns, a man in a gray suit sat alone. No one noticed him, except Lena. He wasn't eating. He wasn't talking. He was simply watching. His eyes were sharp and deep, his shirt collar open, no tie, casually dressed in the way only someone who'd already reached the top could afford to be. It was Thomas Ellington. A few recognized the name from tech billionaire lists. Some knew he was a global education investor, but most just knew. He was a guest of someone important. Only Lena knew more than that. Thomas looked her way, not with curiosity, but with the gaze of someone who was seeing a woman who had once left a lasting mark. Lena nodded slightly. No words were needed, just a gesture. The kind old souls understand. Elsewhere in the garden, Julian stood next to Claire. "I don't think she should be treated like this," he said quietly. Claire looked away. "I know, but it's our wedding day. I don't want drama." Julian glanced at his grandmother sitting alone, then back at his bride. "She's lived with drama her whole life. We're just starting to feel it." Claire didn't respond, but the words stayed with her. At that moment, Thomas set down his drink, leaned toward the event coordinator, and said something quietly. The young man nodded and immediately walked toward the stage. Margot was mid-conversation with a sponsor when she noticed him stepping up to the microphone. Her brow furrowed. Charles glanced over too, his fingers tightening around his wine glass. This wasn't on the program. The announcer's voice echoed through the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, tonight we are joined by a distinguished guest, someone who has made remarkable contributions to both the business world and social progress. Please welcome Mr. Thomas Ellington." The entire garden stilled. Laughter cut off. Wine glasses froze mid-air. Margot immediately fixed her hair. Charles sat up straighter. Claire's eyes widened. Julian said nothing. Thomas rose to his feet. But instead of heading toward the stage, he turned and walked straight toward Lena. No one stopped him. No one dared to guess what was happening. He stopped in front of her. No polite handshake, no half-hearted bow. He bowed fully. "Madam Whitmore," he said clearly, "it's been too long." Lena looked up, her gaze calm and unwavering. "Thomas," she smiled, "you've still got that honesty I remember." The air was still, utterly still. Julian stood up straighter, eyes shining, and Margot nearly dropped her glass. Thomas gestured for the microphone. Taking it, he turned to face the crowd. "I know this wasn't part of the program," he began, "but some things don't need scheduling. Because when something is right, it doesn't need permission." A low murmur rippled through the garden like a soft wave. But Thomas remained focused. "Many of you know me from the financial headlines, from investment briefings or global education campaigns. But I wouldn't be here, wouldn't have a career, wouldn't have a life of purpose, if it weren't for the woman seated before you, Mrs. Lena Whitmore." Breaths caught. That name, now finally spoken in full, seemed to echo louder than anything else that day. "Madam Whitmore," he continued, "was the one who saw me when no one else bothered to look. She gave me my first investment, out of a fund she built herself with nothing but her hands and her will. But it wasn't just me. It was hundreds of black-owned businesses, thousands of minority students, single mothers, people who never got a seat at tables like this. All of them found footing because of the foundation she built. The garden fell silent, not just in awe, but in guilt. A few who had scoffed now lowered their heads. Eyes that once glanced past Lena now stayed fixed on her and held. Claire clenched the folds of her wedding gown, her face pale. Julian had already moved, no longer standing as the groom, but as a man who knew exactly where he stood. Thomas looked slowly around, then added, "In my life, no one has taught me more than she has, not through lessons, but by the way she lives. When she had power, she didn't show it off. When disrespected, she didn't retaliate. And today, when some of you chose to ignore her, she remained seated, composed, gracious, as if those little stings couldn't touch her. Because she knows character doesn't come from where you sit or whose name is on the invitation. Character is how you treat people when no one's watching, and you're not required to care." A small round of applause began from the far end of the garden. Not loud, but real. Then it spread. And soon, the entire venue was clapping. Not the kind of applause meant to match a mood, the kind that erupts when people realize they've just witnessed something true. In the middle of a ceremony built on an image, Margot Remington tried to stay still, but her hand trembled so badly she had to set her glass down. Charles's face flushed deep red as he adjusted his tie, unable to hide his unease. They had believed themselves the most powerful people in the room. Now they knew. They were just shadows in a space that Lena Whitmore lit by simply being. Julian approached his grandmother's table. He didn't speak. He just bowed, and stood beside her like an unshakable monument. Claire watched from the aisle, her heart sinking like stone. She wanted to walk over, wanted to say something, but no words felt big enough to erase the silence she had once helped maintain. Thomas set the microphone down, turned to Lena, and smiled gently. "Thank you for everything, and for being here today." Lena gave a soft nod. No speech, no tears, just a smile, light as a period at the end of a long sentence, and the beginning of something real. After the applause faded, the air in the garden thickened. The music had stopped. The clinking of glasses is gone. All the earlier arrogance had vanished, as if something far greater had just stepped into the space. Claire stood in the center of the stone path, her hands clenched pale white. Her perfectly styled hair trembled slightly in the evening breeze, but she felt nothing. For the first time, she was forced to face herself through the eyes of the woman she had chosen to ignore. Julian took one step forward, standing tall next to his grandmother. "That's enough," he said, not loud, but crystal clear. "My grandmother stayed quiet all evening out of courtesy for people who don't even understand what courtesy is. Now it's my turn." Every head turned. People said I was lucky to marry Claire, to join a family with roots. But if those roots are built on contempt, they're not worth holding on to. Margot forced a tight smile, stepping closer to Lena with hands folded respectfully. "Madame Whitmore, I'm so sorry. I truly didn't know." Lena looked up. Her gaze was calm, but piercing. "No, you knew. You just didn't think I mattered enough to know your name, to be greeted, or to be seated near the center." Margot froze. Lena went on, "And I don't need an apology to elevate my status. I need people to understand that kindness isn't a privilege. It's the bare minimum of being human." Final chapter. English translation. In seamless, cinematic, emotionally resonant style. Charles interjected, forcing a stiff smile. "Perhaps we didn't start off right, but maybe, in time, we could—" Lena didn't reply. She stood, turned, and walked away. No words, just firm, deliberate steps. And that was the clearest refusal one could ever give, without saying a single thing. Julian turned to Claire. "Do you want to say something?" Claire hesitated for a beat, then stepped forward. "Madam Whitmore," she said, her voice trembling, I have no excuse. I was silent. And that silence shames me." Lena paused. She didn't turn fully, just tilted her head slightly. "I know an apology isn't enough," Claire continued, "but if you'll allow me, I want to start again. Not for Julian. For myself." Silence. Then Lena turned to face her. Her gaze met Claire's, deep and unflinching, as if looking straight through to her soul. "Starting again doesn't begin with words," Lena said quietly. "It begins with how you choose to live. Starting now." Claire nodded, slowly, but with certainty. Thomas Ellington, still nearby, smiled gently. He didn't need to add anything. Everything that needed saying had already been spoken, through Lena Whitmore's poise, her eyes, and a presence that required no business card to validate. The sun sank lower behind the vineyard hills, its final golden light cast softly across the rows of chairs and floral arches. But it wasn't the light of glory anymore. It was the light of awakening. The string quartet began playing again, but this time no one clapped, no one danced, no one cared about making an impression anymore. Margot and Charles Remington sat quietly near the reception tent. Their faces no longer wore the confidence of hosts behind a perfect event. Only the dazed look of two people confronting a question they had never dared to ask. Was the foundation they'd built ever really solid? No one came to take photos with them. No one asked about investments or influence. They weren't condemned. But they were seen as the ones who stayed silent when they should have spoken. Lena Whitmore was different. She never stood on stage, never gave a speech, never accepted any award. But after Thomas Ellington's bow, guest after guest approached her, not to flatter, not to beg, but to admit they'd learned something from a woman who never set out to teach, but made everyone learn. A young server gently touched Lena's shoulder. "I'd heard your name before," she whispered, "but today I truly understand." Lena nodded. Just once. No more words needed. Nearby, Julian held Claire's hand. They were no longer just a couple from a guest list, but two people who had stepped out of a mold someone else had created for them. "I don't want today to be just a moment," Claire said. "I want it to be a beginning." Julian didn't answer. He just held her hand tighter. Then both of them turned to Lena. "We'll live in a way that makes you proud," Julian said. "Not just today, but every day." Lena didn't say "I'm proud," because she knew pride isn't a feeling you say once. It's earned, with time, with choices, with how you live. She simply smiled. The kind of smile that says, there is still hope in this world, if people still know how to listen, and have the courage to change. The reception ended as sunset blanketed Rosemore Estate like a velvet curtain closing on a story no one saw coming. No fireworks, no closing speech. Only Lena Whitmore, the woman once dismissed, once pushed to the margins, walking away in silence. But this time, her silence wasn't invisible. It was the radiance of someone who had already won, not through power, but through grace. Thank you for staying through to the end of the story. In a world full of noise and judgment, sometimes what stops us isn't what's shouted, but what's spoken in silence. If Lena Whitmore's story moved you, share it. Not for the drama, but for the message that every one of us will need at some point. Kindness is never outdated, and character never needs a title to be introduced.